Today's lesson is on matching graphs and formulas, and this will cover pages 97 and 98 in your Jump Math book. Question number 1 is going to ask you to find the gaps in the sequence without writing the sequence for the pattern rule. So they will give you a pattern rule, such as start at 15 and subtract 4 each time. So the way that you would write this is you would look at what happens each time. Well, we subtract 4 each time, so that will be our gap. So our gap would be -4. So if it's subtract, we'll put a negative. If it's add, we will put a positive, okay? Question number 2 is similar, but instead of asking you to find the gaps from a pattern rule, they're going to ask you to find the gaps from a formula. So I've shown you 2 examples of formulas here. So we have 4n plus 2 and 7 minus 3n. So you'll notice that the coefficient and variable are in different positions. So when we're using a formula, we are actually going to look at the coefficient to tell us the gaps. So remember, the coefficient, co means with, is the number that is beside the variable. So in the first one, we'll look at the number 4, and the second one, we'll look at the number 3. Now we have these in 2 different positions. So when we look here, there's nothing before the 4, so that means it's like a positive. There's an invisible positive. So our gap for this first one would be +4. Whereas in our second formula here, the 3 has a negative or a subtracting sign right before it. So our gap, we're going to be subtracting something bigger each time, right? Because 3 times 1 is 3, but then 3 times 2 is 6. So we'd actually be subtracting more every time. So our number would become less. So our gap for the second one is -3. So just remember, if there is nothing before the coefficient, it's got an invisible positive sign, so it's +4. If there is a subtraction sign before the coefficient, then it's a negative gap. Now, I don't think they would give you any examples like this. Oh, maybe there are a couple. But if we had switched the order around for these two, the 4n plus 2 to be 2 plus 4n, we could look at what comes in front of that 4, because that's the coefficient. It's beside the variable, so this would still have the gap of +4. Question number 3 has a few separate parts. They're going to start by giving you a graph, and then that has the term number and the term value on the x and the y axis. And then they're going to ask you to write the term values and find the gaps. To find the term values, we'll need to look at the y-axis. The x-axis is basically just telling us what order the number is going. So we've got the first number, the second number, third number, and the fourth number. So our first term, we look at the y-axis, is 1. So we'll put 1 as our first term in the sequence. Our second value matches to 3 on the y-axis. So our second term is 3. Our third term matches with 8, so that would be 8 in the sequence. And then our final and fourth term is 9. So we would put that onto our sequence. Then we find the gap. So to get from 1 to 3, we need to add 2. 3 to 8, we need to add 5. And 8 plus 1 is 9. The second question asks us if the gaps show the difference between the term values or the term numbers. And if we look at our term numbers, they're just going up by 1 each time, because they basically tell you if it's the first, second, third, or fourth number. The gaps, they correspond to our term values, right? This goes up by 2, and then up by 5, and up by 1. The final question asks you if you will look at the horizontal axis so it's going left to right, or the vertical axis, which goes up and down, to see the gap between terms in the sequence. So we've said that it's a term value, so which axis is the term value? Is it vertical or is it horizontal? Question number 4 is going to give you a graph and a couple of questions. So they'll actually have a series of graphs. I'm just doing one, and your first job is going to be to write the gaps, so to find the gaps in the graph without writing out the sequence. And the second part, in your book, it will ask you to match the formula to the graph, but I'm just going to show you how to practice writing the formula from scratch just from looking at a graph. To find the gaps, we simply need to look at what the spacing is between two sets of points. So from the first to the second term, it goes up 2, and then it goes up another 2, goes up another 2, goes up another 2. So our gap here is plus 2. Now when we're looking at our formula, we know that if our gap is add 2, that means our coefficient for our variable, the number that goes beside our variable or we multiply it by, is going to be positive 2. So our formula will start with 2n, okay? So if we have 2n, that would mean that our first term would equal 2. But we actually need our first term to equal 1. So to get from 2 to 1, we subtract 1, and that gives us 1. So let's see if that works for the second term. If we say 2n minus 1. So if we go 2 times 2 minus 1, that equals 4 minus 1 equals 3. And if I look, when my x value is 2, my y value is 3. So this is my formula. But when you're matching, you will probably just need to see, okay, does your gap, which one has the coefficient that matches your gap? Question 5 is also a 3-part question. The first part asks you to find the first term, so to basically solve for n equals 1. So they will give you a formula, such as 4n plus 3, and you have to figure out the first term. So we replace our n value, or we substitute it with 1, because that's what they asked us to do here for the first term. So 4 times 1 is 4, plus 3 is 7. So your first term is 7. Now, part B might very well be the most confusing instructions ever. So we need to sift through a good chunk of vocabulary. They will give you a graph, and they're asking you to find the first term in the sequence by finding the second coordinate when the first coordinate is 1. Now, this can lead to a lot of confusion because sometimes we confuse the terms term and first and second coordinate. So when they're talking about a term in a sequence, they're literally saying if you had a sequence of numbers, the first number is term 1. So if you were to write a sequence from the graph, what would the first term be? And when they're talking about the second coordinate and the first coordinate, they're actually referring to ordered pairs. So remember, the first number would be the first coordinate, and the second number would be the second coordinate, obviously, right? So when you think of your first and second coordinates, there is an x value and there is a y value, and they're always in alphabetical order. So the first coordinate is always the x value, and the second coordinate is the y value. So basically, what you're doing is start by looking at the first point on the graph. Once you've located the first point, Then you're going to find the y coordinate. So when x is 1, what is the y value? So the y value is that vertical axis, and that will be your first term. So that is what you will write on the line below, is that y coordinate. Part C of this question is going to ask you to match the graph to the formula. So in part A, you figured out the first term was 7. So then when you look at the graphs, you'd have to see, okay, which graph is the first term 7? And then you'd put the letter for that graph beside the matching formula for part C. Question 6 is basically a combination of these questions. So it will give you 3 formulas and 3 graphs, and they will ask you to match each formula to a graph. The 2 things that you'll want to look at are what are the gaps and what are the first terms. So the coefficient will tell you what your gap is, but there are 2 formulas that have the same gap. So you'll also need to look at what is the first term. So if you make n equal 1 and then solve your formula, what answer do you get to figure out which one matches? For question number 7, they give you the beginning of some formulas, so they'll give you the coefficient with the variable, and they'll give you the operation, and then you fill it in. So you could do 3n plus 12, or 524, or plus 2, right? Whatever you want to do. And then for each of those formulas, you're going to draw a graph. Part C is optional because we're not in the classroom. So it says to have a partner match the formulas to the graphs. Now, if you guys are in contact with each other, you could take a picture of them and send it to one of your friends and see if they can match them up. But that isn't necessary at all because we aren't really that accessible right now. As always, there will be a Google form attached to this lesson for you to fill out. Remember to click the purple submit button and the green mark as done button. But if you need help, please reach out and I'm happy to set up a Zoom meeting.